Hello everybody and welcome back to my studio. For those of you who are new, my name is Alejandro. I'm a media composer, sound designer, and sample instrument creator. And today I am very excited to share with you an instrument that I started working on a few months ago, that it took a bit longer to get ready, but it's finally here and I couldn't be happier to share it with you. Before I go on with the big announcement, I want to thank every single one of you who've been downloading my instruments on my Acousmatic Sounds store on my website. There's been so many downloads over the past few months, and honestly it really pumps me up to create more instruments. And I think even more importantly, it makes it worthwhile having spent the time I did creating the instruments I have already. Sometimes it might not be that straightforward when you're creating something new. I think that the most downloaded instrument I have is actually an instrument directly related to this announcement today, and that's the Remote Violin Nano. That was sort of a pilot version of the instrument that I am very proud to share with you today, and that is the full version, the pro version if you will, of the Remote Violin. The pilot version of the instrument includes a lot less sound sources, and although I did put a lot of time into the UI and making sure that it was going to be as playable as possible, it doesn't have as many round robins as this full version has. This one has a total of 3 round robins for all of the sounds that you're going to be able to play with. Making this instrument was really an exciting process because of 2 reasons. The first one being that it's the biggest instrument that I've ever created. That's not only in complexity, but also really in size of the final download folder. As I was adding more and more layers and making new groups and playing around with it, I really wasn't aware. I wasn't keeping track of the size of the instrument, and when I sent out the first beta version to be tested by a friend of mine, I realized that it was already 1.5 gigabytes, I think. So that in itself posed a lot of issues that I was going to have to solve, that I have solved at the moment, which mainly had to deal with how that instrument was going to be downloaded on my store. I try to be as organized as possible to make sure that I didn't run into a lot of hurdles when this instrument was ready to be released. And it's finally the day. I'm very happy that I get to finally share it with all of you. I'll describe the new interface step by step, because not only is each individual sound source quite interesting in and of itself, but there's also a few hidden features, especially with the Modwheel. So I want to explain what went behind me creating those specific sounds. If you're familiar with the Nano version of the Remote Violin, you would have already noticed the sound quality that it has. It's a very intimate sounding instrument. This is in part due to the way that it was recorded. It was recorded using an iPhone. It was a very peculiar and very unique way to capture, especially an instrument that we are very much familiar with. So capturing it this way, which is very representative of our current situation, everyone being confined in their own spaces, it brings that instrument forward in a new light. It's very musical, very intimate in a very literal way because of how it was recorded. The violinist recorded it herself on her room. So there's this kind of like diary quality to the instrument. It's as though someone was playing right next to you in your room. One big challenge that I posed myself too was to take those qualities that I just mentioned and try to push them forward. Try to push the recording to its limit in a way that does tie with the theme of the instrument, which is remote. Something that's remote implies that something that's very far away, something that's not easy to access, something that might get sort of lost or interrupted in the way. So then the obvious step was to kind of think of interference that could happen, introducing some hiss, fuzz, and cutting and distortion that's unwanted and appears out of nowhere. Something that I had added on the Nano version of the instrument was a reverb that I created using a very kind of dodgy pedal. For this full version, I took that idea a little bit further, and not only using the same pedal but also using spaces themselves, so recording the same direct signal, the original signal, playing back in a room multiple times and sort of capturing the space of a room that's, again, not ideal, not great, but there's still something there. I paid particular attention to how I wanted to organize the UI and what controls I wanted to put out there, because If we think of, the big libraries out there and the way that they're recorded, the fact that they have multiple mic positions, the control that we have with those libraries, for instance, with Spitfire Audio, you get to control the expression, the dynamics, the vibrato, a lot of these things that make the instrument what they are. And now in this case, of course, I didn't have the budget to do something like that, and that was not really the mission that I had. But I did think that it would be worth it to include some of those controls that we're already very familiar with. For example, CC11, which we know controls expression. In the case of this instrument, it does exactly that. It controls the expression for all of the different sound sources. I decided to add this so that when you decide to use the remote violin as a supplement to your string section, you can use it in the way that you're already familiar with, and it's going to be just as playable. The big difference in this case is that the Modwheel is not going to control the dynamics. The instrument is velocity sensitive, and there's also volume sliders to control each individual sound source. Exploring the possibilities that this instrument will provide is going to be a very fun ride, I'm sure. However, I decided to include some screenshots to show you just how versatile the instrument can be, and how the palette can change quite drastically depending on how you play around with it. But enough about me talking about it, let's dive in and I'll describe to you each of the sound sources, each of the controls and what you can do with them. And here it is. This is the new Remote Violin by Acousmatic Sounds. Very happy to share this instrument with you. As you can see in the interface, as soon as you open up, you can see that there's going to be this little wave things. Those are your volume sliders. You can control it either with your mouse or, as all of my instruments, they're going to be CC assignable. I've already assigned it to my controller, so as you can see, all of the controls work seamlessly. They work perfectly well. Underneath the controls, you'll see the description of each of the different sounds. First, we have the direct signal, then interfered, high frequency, modulated, distorted, and finally a reverb. Underneath the name, you'll see there's another controller, and this controls the panning. It's also CC assignable, and you can also control it with your mouse. Underneath, we have these 4 lines, and what they do is they control the envelope: attack, decay, sustain, and release. This will control the envelope of all of the sound sources except for the reverb. When you first open the instrument, it's going to open in one of the screenshots, which is called Direct Phone Violin. In this first screenshot, all of the attention goes towards the direct signal. This particular screenshot is the most honest representation of what the raw recordings were. Let's have a listen. Remember that the instrument is velocity sensitive and that C11 is going to control the overall expression of the instrument, no matter what sound source you have on. Let's go through the different dynamic layers so you can hear the difference in the timbre of the violin. It also works really well if you play with it as a section and not only as a mono instrument. Before we go through all of the screenshots, let's go through each individual sound first. Let's put all of the controls at 0 and try out just the direct signal, more or less at 0 dBs, the expression as well, the expression at 100%, and let's listen to what this sounds like. You'll notice that when you press down on a note, it's not going to loop. However, each of the audio files have 3 different bowings. That means that it's going to start at a down bow, then it's going to go up, and then down again. And that's going to be true throughout the instrument. However, the softer you play a note, the longer it's going to be. This is just because of the physicality of when you play something very low, how it's going to take a little longer for the violinist to use the whole bow. And then the louder you play, it's going to be faster because you need to keep that dynamic up. So let's hear what that sounds like. I'm going to play an E, and I'm going to play it as soft as I can. So there you could hear the 3 different bows. If we press the same note, but this time I press it a little bit harder, you can hear we still get the 3 bows, but this time it's going to be a little bit shorter. Now let's go as hard as we can. Now this time again, 3 bows, but just slightly shorter because it just takes less time for the violinist to use the bow each time they go. You will notice that when we use the direct signal all by itself, the lowest note we're gonna have is G3, because that's the lowest note that the violin is able to produce. If we're trying to go lower than that, we're not gonna get anything. But with the rest of the signals, that's not gonna be an issue, because it's going to be a sound that's not supposed to be as natural as possible. The highest note in this register is going to be this C. Alright, so that's the direct signal. Before we move on to the next one, let's play it with the Modwheel, because the Modwheel is going to introduce us to a few surprises on each individual sound source. They're all going to be slightly different. I'm gonna open an instance of just a FabFilter Pro so we can have a look at what happens when we introduce the Modwheel. Let's play that E note again. So here we see all the frequency information included. Now let's play that E again, and I'm gonna introduce the Modwheels as I go. That might not have been super obvious, but if you notice on the graph, we're introducing a lot of bottom end that wasn't there before. And if you were listening to with headphones, you're gonna notice that there's a little crackling going on. Now I have the Modwheel all the way up right now. I'm gonna play that E again. Now that I have both open at the same time, we can see what I do with the Modwheel. So what's happening here is quite interesting, and I feel like it's really cool because it opens the possibilities for the instrument a lot. What I'm introducing with the Modwheel is actually some tape saturation that I got by running the direct signal through a tape recorder a few times. So there's a lot of bottom end that's being introduced. There's a lot of this little like crackling that sort of interrupts every now and then, and it adds a lot of character to the sound. And if you notice too, the dry signal is a mono signal, but the cassette signal is actually stereo. So you will notice that something happens. You'll notice that something's going to change with the width of our sound as soon as I play with the Modwheel. It opens up because it's literally shifting between a mono signal to a stereo signal, and the phase is not the same. So there's a few phase issues that I purposely left there because we are playing off this idea of an instrument that was recorded in a less than ideal space with a less than ideal microphone. So I wanted to keep that sort of roughness as natural as possible. All right, so that's the direct signal. Before moving on, just very quickly, you can see that there's a pan control that just offers a lot of possibilities. Let's move on to our second sound source, which I've named interfered. Because this is velocity sensitive, depending on how hard you hit the note, you're gonna get a very different sound quality. Let's go back to our E. I'm gonna put the expression at 100%, and I'm gonna play the note as soft as I can. Now I'm gonna bring down the expression and I'll press the same note as hard as I can. And let's see what happens when we play with the Modwheel. Play with panning at the same time. Now, something that's going to be very helpful with the rest of the sound sources, not so much with the direct signal, and that's the envelope controls that I included here. If you play with the attack, this makes this instrument incredibly versatile because you can have an instance playing a line with just a direct signal or a combination, and then you can have a different instance and you control it as a synth. All right, now let's try to bring this as close to as it was before. All right, let's move on to the next. I was thinking of the original sound recorded by the phone as a signal going through a whole chain of different, stops that I've kind of represented in the interface by this pulse. So in each of those poles, there could potentially be something that goes on that could alter and make any signal going through it a little bit dirtier or harder to understand. I wanted to think of each of these as sort of a pole that's introducing something completely new. Now, if we go to the high frequency section, as the name suggests, I'm basically focusing on the high frequency content of each of the notes. Now, that doesn't mean that I've cut everything under 1K or something like that. What that means is basically I took out all of the actual sort of note information, and what I left was just the room and all, the nitty-gritty of the bow passing through the strings. And let's have a listen, and that will make a little bit more sense. It's basically all of the sounds that a violin would produce minus the actual note that we would listen to. So it's almost like an old piece of hardware, something that's very much in vogue nowadays, that's basically just providing you with this raw signal that you can then resample and do something with. Let's move on to the next. We have the modulated. This one's really, really fun. Now this one is really interesting because it kind of sounds, like an old synth string sound. It sounds like a fake violin, kind of, like from an old Yamaha synth or Casio synth even. So that one's really, really fun. And then if we introduce the Modwheel, now let's go ahead and try to think of this again as a sort of like a synth, and let's dive into the controls and see what we can come up with. Let's move over to the next sound, distorted. What I've had included in the Modwheel is just an exaggeratedly distorted version of this, to provide you with as many possibilities as you can, because you can play with the expression, bringing this up, and it just becomes, like a broken radio almost. All right, now let's move on to the last one, the reverb. You will notice, first of all, that there are two panning controls over here. That's because there are two reverbs going on at the same time. The best way to know what's going on is just to have a listen. Now, if you notice, what's happening on the left and on the right is quite different. Now, something that I really liked, and the reason why I added these two controls, is if you put both in the center, then you have one single sounding reverb signal. But then if you pan them, you get this really interesting sort of stereo. If you automated this, then you can have this whole thing moving on around you. Now again, let's play around with the Modwheel and see what happens. Now, I mentioned before that when you're playing with the direct signal, you're only going to start hearing notes as of G2. But with the rest, you can go a little bit lower, down to C0. That goes for a lot of the signals, not just... Before we finish up, I want to show you a few of the other screenshots that I've included. Now, obviously here we've been playing around with what we had open originally as the direct phone violin. Let's have a look at the second screenshot I've included. It's called Lo-Fi String Pad. This screenshot shows you a complete different flavor. Let's check out the next one. Reverb Dream. And finally, Wide and Slow. As we saw at the beginning, and that is basically it. That was the Remote Violin in a nutshell. I am very excited for you to try it out, and more excited to hear the kind of compositions that you will come up with using this instrument. I hope that you have as much fun playing with it as I had creating it. I could not be happier about this instrument, and I cannot wait for you to try it out yourself and for you to share the music that this instrument inspires. I want to give a very big shout out to all of my current patrons. Because of your support, I'm able to spend more time not just on the musical side of it, but also in the design part of it, thinking of ways of making it more intuitive and just overall more interesting for you to play with. If you're perhaps interested in becoming a patron yourself, then I invite you to check out my Patreon page. I'm gonna leave a link in the description below. There's multiple tiers to choose from. You can get new music every month, exclusive new sample instruments for patrons only, and you can also get discounts on the instruments already on my Acousmatic Sounds store. If you made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. I would really appreciate it if you would like the video and share it with other people you know are making music and could be interested. I love seeing the community around these instruments grow every time I put out a new instrument. It's really motivating. The next months are going to be quite busy and exciting for Acousmatic Sounds. There are some instruments that are ready to see the light of day. I just need to create a couple of walkthrough videos for it, maybe create some trailers, and I'm also going to begin working on the remote cello. I had the session with the musician, and that actually was around a month ago, so I've been sitting on the project for a little while. I don't know exactly when I'm going to have the instrument ready. It's probably going to be in the summer. So again, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel because there's going to be a lot new material coming very soon. And that's it for now. Thank you again. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.